Welcome back. A small detail can flip an entire story, and we're about to see how. At the end, tell us whether you agree or challenge our conclusion. On the night of February 27, 1973, citizens of the Oglala Lakota Oyate, together with organizers from the American Indian Movement, entered the hamlet of Wounded Knee on Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota, and took control of the trading post, the church, and nearby buildings. Barricades went up along the approaches. Within hours, a federal cordon formed outside the village led by the United States Marshal Service with support from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Bureau of Indian Affairs, police, and state and tribal forces. Inside the lines were elders' families, local leaders, and AIM spokesmen who said the site was chosen because memory still lives there from 1890. The local political landscape was already tense. Many Oglala citizens opposed the sitting tribal administration and accused its security allies of intimidation. National treaty claims converged with those local grievances. In the days that followed, assistant attorneys general and field negotiators opened channels to prevent a direct assault, while occupiers issued statements calling for hearings on treaty obligations and for outside scrutiny of governance on Pine Ridge. Winter cold and distance shaped every choice. Supplies were finite. The terrain offered cover but not endurance. The principal actors were Oglala citizens and elders allied with AIM leaders, including Dennis Banks, Russell Means, and Carter Camp, on one side, and on the other the United States Marshal Service, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Bureau of Indian Affairs, police, South Dakota authorities, and tribal police aligned with the elected chairman Richard Wilson. Clergy, journalists, and lawyers moved between lines as intermediaries when permitted. Each step risked another headline and another wound. The guiding question for this episode is direct. What pressures and decisions in early 1973 brought Oglala citizens and AIM organizers to occupy Wounded Knee, and why did the 71-day siege push federal tribal relations towards self-determination reforms that outlasted the barricades? Through winter 1972 into early 1973, a chain of events tightened across Pine Ridge and the northern plains. The long arc reached back to the Fort Laramie Treaties of 1851 and 1868, which promised defined homelands and federal obligations that Lakota leaders said had been eroded by rail corridors, mining leases, and allotment policy. In the 20th century, the Indian Reorganization Act altered governance forms, yet the later termination push and jurisdiction transfers left many communities navigating overlapping authorities. By the late 1960s, the Red Power movement redirected national attention. In 1969, young organizers occupied Alcatraz. In November 1972, caravans reached Washington under the banner Trail of Broken Treaties, and protesters entered the Bureau of Indian Affairs building to force a hearing on treaty and program failures. The federal response was mixed. Promises of review were paired with arrests and surveillance. On Pine Ridge, the mood hardened. Local pressures were specific. The Black Hills claim remained unresolved, while grazing and resource leases on reservation lands appeared to benefit outside partners. Boarding school legacies and BIA policing rules were felt in daily life. The elected administration on Pine Ridge under Chairman Richard Wilson faced organized opposition that alleged selective enforcement and intimidation by a tribal security group known on the reservation as the Guardians of the Oglala Nation. Winter magnified every grievance. Money ran thin, roads iced over, families calculated fuel, flour, and coffee week by week. A proximate trigger came on January 27, 1973, when Wesley Bad Heart Bull, an Oglala man, was killed in the town of Buffalo Gap. The charging decisions that followed were seen by Native organizers as lenient toward non-Native defendants. Protests spread through January and February. On February 6, a demonstration at the courthouse in Custer escalated into a confrontation that left the building damaged and dozens arrested. Warrants and bond conditions now entangled prominent American Indian Movement figures who had come to support local organizers. The occupation of Wounded Knee would soon be framed by these cases and by the belief among Oglala dissidents that conventional channels on Pine Ridge could not deliver impartial inquiry. Policy signals from Washington cut both ways. In July 1970, President Nixon's message on Indian affairs endorsed self-determination and a move away from termination, but the practical reach of those promises depended on negotiations with agencies and on congressional action still to come. On the ground, BIA police structures remained, as did federal prosecutorial power under major crimes jurisdiction and the investigative reach of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The United States Marshal Service held responsibility for federal court orders and for any custody arising from the winter protests. Each layer of authority would soon be present on the roads leading into Wounded Knee. By mid-February 1973, objectives had crystallized for both sides. Oglala dissidents and their American Indian Movement allies sought public leverage to compel hearings on treaty enforcement and to secure outside scrutiny of reservation governance. They judged that a peaceful but firm control of a symbol-laden place would draw national attention and force negotiations without ceding the narrative to court filings alone. Their constraints were sharp. Ammunition and food were finite. Reliable radios were few. Winter weather narrowed approach routes to a handful of passable roads and draws. Couriers and sympathizers could move at night, but every trip risked arrest. Federal and state authorities aimed to prevent loss of life, restore control of the hamlet, and avoid images of an assault at a site already marked by the dead of 1890. Their constraints were political as much as tactical. Any heavy action could produce casualties and deepen national scrutiny. Yet a siege without clear progress risked drift. The United States Marshal Service would have to maintain outer roadblocks for weeks in poor conditions, while coordinating with FBI agents, BIA police, and South Dakota forces. Fuel rations, food, and medical support for personnel stationed on ridges and road junctions had to be kept steady despite wind and snow. The logistical picture that set the stage for the occupation was therefore uneven. Inside Pine Ridge, opposition networks identified drivers' safe houses and church contacts across scattered communities. Outside the cordon, federal agencies assembled armored personnel carriers to move wounded under fire if needed, and placed night observation posts on the higher ground above the approaches to the trading post and church. Before the first barricade went up, both sides already understood the map. The hamlet lay in a shallow bowl with low ridges that offered cover for short exchanges but little shelter from a long winter. The symbolic choice of Wounded Knee guaranteed attention. The terrain and the season guaranteed hardship. By the last week of February, the timeline converged. Court dates from the Custer protest loomed. Families on Pine Ridge debated risk versus silence. AM leaders weighed warrants and travel restrictions against calls from local elders to make a stand. Federal planners drafted rules of engagement that emphasized restraint and documentation. What followed on February the 27th was the product of both deep treaty history and immediate winter pressures. One side sought a hearing on obligations and legitimacy. The other sought control without bloodshed. Both would be tested by distance weather and the arithmetic of supply. Night fell hard on February 27, 1973, as Oglala Lakota citizens allied with American Indian Movement organizers took the crossroads at Wounded Knee on Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota. The first escalation was swift and local. Telephone lines in the hamlet went dead or unreliably live. A hand-painted checkpoint faced the east approach near the trading post, while younger pickets watched the shallow draws to the south and west. The winter air was dry and cutting. Federal response formed outside the bowl of ground. The United States Marshal Service set its first roadblocks on the better approaches and radioed for reinforcement. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents established an operations trailer closer to Pine Ridge Village and coordinated with Bureau of Indian Affairs police and South Dakota officers for perimeter patrols. Through that first week, couriers and battered sedans felt their way at night along section roads, lights off until the last bend, testing what the cordon would allow. Inside the hamlet, elders held prayer in the church, while AIM spokesmen fixed the message to treaty obligations and to the political fear many Oglala families said they lived with through the prior year. The immediate effect was to split the reservation into zones of rumor and zones of fact. Past the outer checkpoints, word moved by CB radio relays and by the next driver willing to risk seizure of a trunk full of flour and canned meat. By March 1, the siege pattern took shape. Oglala families who lived near the crossroads were escorted outward if they wished. Volunteers stayed. A few sympathetic ranchers sent hay and food by back routes, but winter mud and wind slowed every mile. Federal radios crackled with sitreps listing muzzle flashes at ridge lines, and the gleam of a pickup turning too late into a field. At dawn, the low ridges held frost, and the defenders moved slowly to keep their silhouettes off the skyline. In the afternoons, the negotiators tried to enter. An interpreter from the community walked with clergy to the inner line and carried back conditions the occupiers would accept. Amnesty and a public hearing on treaties were immovable points. Each dusk, the air grew brittle, and someone fired. Neither side controlled every finger on a trigger after dark. The signal to shoot was too often the crack of a distant shot. The first formal parley came on March 13 when a senior Department of Justice envoy arrived with marshals to open a table inside the town. Occupiers insisted that the word treaty be written into any document, or at least spoken in public by Washington. Federal officials were willing to discuss reviews and hearings, but not to concede the legal framing the activists demanded. That difference survived every draft. Nights that week were louder. Flares arced against the black and fell hissing into the grass beyond the berms. Reporters who had slipped in earlier days found access tightening, as federal managers restricted on-site press to a few pooled visits. Oglala residents outside the cordon complained that their roads were treated as tactical space and that ordinary movement to relatives or stores could bring a search. The occupation had redrawn the map of daily life. On March 16, the second escalation struck with bitter clarity. Marshals moving along a perimeter near a shallow cut came under fire. One of them, Lloyd Grimm, was hit and fell. The bullet damaged his spine. Radios that night carried clipped voices routing medics forward and clearing a path for evacuation. Inside the hamlet, the news traveled by whispers and by the faces of clergy who had been at the parley. Federal posture hardened, as the cost to their own was now permanent. Armored personnel carriers appeared on the roads after that week, their tracks scoring the thawing shoulder, and their engines audible long before they were seen cresting the low ridges above the approaches. Spring crept across the plains in inches. Snow squalls still cut visibility in the mornings and then gave way to wet roads by afternoon. The occupiers rationed ammunition to sectors and rotated pickets with a kind of ritual that included a brief prayer and a reminder to waste no rounds. Couriers switched to walking the last mile after nightfall and carried lists from elders who worried over children or over a distant cousin arrested at the Custer Courthouse protest. Federal agents logged outgoing and incoming rounds and returned fire from covered positions near culverts and pasture breaks. In some places, an Oglala interpreter still carried messages and scripture verses between the lines. In others, the only speech was the sharp bang of a rifle and the slower thump of an APC crossing a cattle guard. Mid-April brought the third and deepest escalation. A couple seeking quiet refuge entered the occupied zone and lay down to rest in a church basement. In the days that followed, a burst of gunfire struck the building, and a man later identified in reports as Frank Clearwater was hit. His evacuation under fire etched a new scar on both sides. The hospital beyond the cordon could not reverse what the bullet began. He died after days in care. The effect inside the hamlet was immediate. Watch posts stiffened and tempers thinned. The elders led ceremony in the cold dawn and asked for discipline. Beyond the ridges, federal commanders reviewed the rules of engagement again and repeated the order to avoid an assault unless life was at imminent risk. A few days later, Assistant Attorney General Kent Frizzell returned to the lines. His convoy paused at every checkpoint and then moved forward under arranged holds on fire. The meeting with AM coordinators and Oglala organizers opened with a prayer and with a reading from a list of names of the dead at Wounded Knee in 1890. The room was tight and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and damp wool. The terms on the table shifted slightly. There would be no blanket amnesty. There could be discussions and hearings if the guns were set down and the buildings returned. That night, the wind fell and sound carried far. Both sides heard a single burst and then silence. In the morning, the elders spoke again about patience and about the line between courage and needless loss. Frizzell press remarks. Wounded Knee, April 1973. Our duty is to end this without another tragedy. We have restricted access because the presence of cameras can change choices. We are ready to carry forward the concerns we hear, but we will not negotiate at the muzzle of a rifle. By late April, the couriers were fewer and thinner. Gas was short. A volunteer medic counted bandages with a hand that shook from lack of sleep. The church bell did not ring. It was wrapped in cloth to keep it from marking hours that no one inside wanted to count. The federal perimeter closed to a narrower ring and sight lines tightened across the draws. Night observation devices picked up movement and traced arcs on map boards. In the hamlet, youth who had once carried signs now carried a ration of cartridges and a thermos of weak coffee to the berm where the wind was strongest. News of the paralysis of a marshal and of the death of Frank Clearwater hung in the air with the breath of men and women who could see the end of winter, but not yet the end of the siege. The last days of the month brought one more shock. Lawrence Buddy Lamont, an Oglala citizen, was struck by fire during an exchange near a defensive position. He died there in the place chosen for its history and its burden. Word moved across Pine Ridge by pickup and by kitchen telephone, and then across the country by the short statements federal spokesmen allowed, and by the longer stories reporters pieced together from interviews outside the cordon. For the occupiers, the arithmetic of supply and the weight of grief now bent the debate toward terms. For federal managers, the risk of new dead in a place already marked by loss bent decisions toward negotiation. Each side had been tested by weather, by distance, and by the stubborn delay of human communication across barricades. As May approached, the lines of force that began in winter converged on a narrow path out. The sequence that followed was a policy enforcement campaign conducted under winter rules, with armed exchanges at its edges and negotiation in its center. The order of forces was layered by design. The United States Marshal Service held the legal lead for federal authority on the ground. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents provided investigative and tactical support, while Bureau of Indian Affairs police and South Dakota officers manned roadblocks and patrolled the approaches. Inside the hamlet, Oglala citizens and American Indian movement organizers manned sectors around the church, the trading post, and the museum, rotating pickets on the low ridges that ringed the crossroads. Non-combatants remained present throughout, including elders, families, clergy, and volunteer medics who moved under ad hoc understandings that never reached the certainty of a written truce. The march in and the tightening of the ring can be told in road names and in weather. In late February and the first days of March, convoys of marshals, agents, and officers established outer checkpoints on the firmer gravel approaches and then walked the shallow draws to mark sightlines. The terrain was a shallow bowl cut by culverts and fences that favored short bursts of fire and quick retreats rather than any decisive push. The choke points were predictable to both sides. A graded curve that hid a pickup until the last second. A fence line that offered a prone man a moment to fire and roll away. Early on, federal vehicles stayed back from those blind corners. After mid-March, armored personnel carriers appeared on the ridges to ferry wounded and to discourage sudden rushes at the barricades. Their engines could be heard long before their silhouettes showed against the pale sky and their weight carved ruts into the thawing shoulder. The rules of engagement were issued from Washington and reiterated by the field command. The core was restraint documentation and a bias toward negotiation over assault. Two short orders capture the tone of the campaign. Department of Justice Order, Directive, Washington, March 1973. Maintain the perimeter, return fire only when fired upon, preserve life, record all exchanges of fire with time and position. Assistant Attorney General Office, Instruction, a field relay, April 1973, negotiate daily. Avoid a forced entry unless an immediate threat to life is shown. Prepare for phased disarmament if terms are accepted. First contact under those rules came in fragments rather than in a single clash. The earliest nights saw muzzle flashes traded across a drainage and then silence. By the second week, the pattern of a siege had formed. Marshals logged incoming shots from ridge lines and answered from covered positions near culverts and pasture breaks. Inside the hamlet, ammunition was rationed by sector. The defenders set tripwires of empty cans to catch a night approach and positioned lookouts to watch the glow of cigarette tips along the outer fence lines. Lines of communication were imperfect on both sides. Federal radios crackled and died at the bottoms of cuts. Couriers from the hamlet walked the last stretch without lights, carrying lists for medicine and for staple foods, and news of the wounded written on scrap paper and pencil. Negotiation beats were threaded through the nights of fire. The arrival of a senior envoy in mid-March brought the first sustained parley. The occupiers insisted that the word treaty be admitted into any formal document and that reservation governance grievances be heard beyond local hands. Federal representatives pressed for a phased disarmament and the return of buildings under a commitment to carry concerns to appropriate channels. The press access narrowed during these sessions. Pool notes replaced earlier free movement, and interviews shifted to the shoulders of roads outside the cordon, where Oglala residents described searches, delays, and a map of daily life that now ran through federal posts. Casualties turned the screws of policy. On March 16, a United States Marshal Lloyd Grimm was shot at the edge of a shallow cut and left paralyzed. The event hardened posture on both sides. Federal commanders moved the armored carriers closer and regularized night observation devices on the ridge lines. Inside the hamlet, the leaders reinforced the rule to hold fire unless fired upon and to minimize exposure on the skyline at first light and last light. In April, a man identified in reports as Frank Clearwater died after being shot during an exchange that struck a church building where he had sought rest. Later in the month, an Oglala citizen, Lawrence Buddy Lamont, was shot and killed near a defensive position. The casualty count never approached that of an assault, but each loss weighed on choices. It is here that a brief fact versus folklore note is necessary. Later retellings sometimes speak of a decisive pitched battle inside the hamlet. The record points instead to a persistent siege marked by sporadic firefights, 2 deaths among the occupiers, numerous injuries among both occupiers and federal personnel, and a steady shift toward negotiation as supplies ran down and grief mounted. Humanitarian outcomes were part of the daily calculus. Elders and families remained within the occupied area. Volunteer medics improvised clinics with limited supplies. Clergy crossed lines under temporary holds on fire, carrying messages, and in some cases administering last rites or prayer. Federal units escorted ambulances when possible, but movement after dark carried risk, and the winter itself was a second adversary. Snow and wind reduced visibility to a few car lengths on some mornings and left the clay roads slick by afternoon. Fuel and food were finite on both sides of the outer lines. The longer the siege ran, the more fragile the logistics became. The enforcement sequence followed a ring strategy that tightened through April. Outer roadblocks screened inbound traffic and turned back vehicles without specific clearance. Inner positions held the ground overlooking the draws and the graded curves that led directly to the trading post and church. Patrols varied routes to prevent pattern attacks. Within the hamlet, AIM coordinators and Oglala organizers assigned sectors to small groups, distributed cartridges with care, and rotated pickets to limit exhaustion. A few sympathetic ranchers and families tried back routes with hay or staples. Some deliveries made it. Others ended in searches and seizures that added to the ledger of grievances that had brought people to the crossroads in the first place. Negotiations evolved with the weather. In early April, with snow still falling some mornings, the talks returned to familiar positions and stalled. In the third week of April, after the death of Frank Clearwater, and after a string of nights with heavier fire, Assistant Attorney General Kent Frizzell re-entered the process. His presence brought a new draft that spoke of hearings and reviews without adopting the legal framing requested by the occupiers. Amnesty remained off the table as a blanket promise. A pathway for phased disarmament and the return of property was drawn in sentences that left room for different readings, a feature that made agreement possible, but also guaranteed argument later about what had been promised in the heat of events. On the ground, the effects of these paper moves showed up first in the pace of fire and in the distance between positions. For a handful of days, the nights were quieter, as both sides tested whether talks might hold. Then a burst of fire would break the quiet, and the next morning would bring another round of messages and of hard looks across the ditch lines. When Buddy Lamont was killed near the end of April, the weight of loss inside the hamlet, and the dread among federal leaders of another death at that place, pulled the negotiations toward a close. 2 short after-action notes capture the endgame. United States Marshals Service, Field Log, Perimeter Sector, late April 1973. APCs, forward to Ridge 3. Night observation confirmed foot movement south draw. Hold return fire unless muzzle flash located. Prepare ambulance corridor on signal. Oglala Organizer. Sector note, Church Line, late April 1973. Distribute 5 rounds each to the berm at dusk. Keep heads low on the ridge at first light. If the envoy returns, no one fires unless fired upon. Speak to the elders at dawn. By the first week of May, the logistics picture was decisive. Ammunition and food inside the hamlet were too thin to sustain another month at the berms. Federal units could hold the lines indefinitely, but risked a catastrophic incident with every night's exchange. The language of a settlement, narrow and carefully constructed, was accepted. On May 8th, the occupation ended. Marshals entered and took possession. Weapons were set down. The buildings were turned over. There was no triumphant march, only a tired exit under watch, and the slow work of cataloging arrests and injuries. The legal path opened by that end would shape the broader legacy. The prosecutions that followed became a second arena in which the siege was judged, and the findings in those cases about official misconduct would rebound onto federal agencies. But in the campaign itself, the confrontation remained what the rules of engagement and the winter had made it. A ring, a set of negotiated pauses, exchanges of fire that rose and fell with rumor and fear, and a closing act written as much by supply and sorrow as by orders from Washington. The turning point formed over 5 days in late April 1973 and became unmistakable on May 8 at Wounded Knee on Pine Ridge Reservation. The principal figures were Assistant Attorney General Kent Frizzell, representing federal authority, Oglala organizers, and elders, carrying the voice of families inside the hamlet, and American Indian Movement coordinators who managed the sectors around the church and trading post. The place was still winter-marked, even as spring crept in. Night wind cut across the low ridges. The ground stayed soft in the afternoons and froze again by dark. The objective for federal command was narrow and repeated in orders: end the occupation without an assault, preserve life, and recover control of the hamlet. The objective for the occupiers had widened into a paradox: hold long enough to force hearings. Constraints drove every choice. Ammunition inside the hamlet was rationed to a handful of rounds per picket at dusk. Rations were thin, and the couriers fewer with each passing night. Radios worked until they did not, and then a runner went by foot. On the outer ring, the United States Marshals Service and supporting agencies could rotate personnel and fuel vehicles, but the risk profile worsened with every hour of darkness. A single ricochet could rewrite the night. Political constraint rode with the tactical one. An assault in that bowl of ground would stain the nation's memory for another century. The initiative shifted with a name. When Lawrence "Buddy" Lamont was shot and killed near a defensive position in the last days of April, a silence moved through the hamlet and out across Pine Ridge. The loss was immediate and human, and it bent the calculus on both sides. Inside, leaders faced families who had already watched the stretcher carry out a wounded man named Frank Clearwater earlier that month, and then heard that he died days later. Outside, federal command saw in the death of Buddy Lamont the edge of a second tragedy layered over the first of 1890. The night after his death, the berms were manned with fewer words. At dawn, elders spoke of patience and of duty to the living. Frizzell's return to the lines in this atmosphere mattered more than the paper he carried. He paused at each checkpoint and entered under arranged holds on fire to sit with organizers whose hands were raw from the cold and from sandbag work. The draft he laid on the table did not say what the occupiers wanted most. It did not promise amnesty, and it did not adopt the legal framing that would place the word treaty at the center of the document. It did, however, sketch a path for phased disarmament, the return of buildings, and the carrying forward of grievances into hearings and reviews. Under the weight of loss and the arithmetic of supply, that path was enough to open a door. The weather gave one last nudge. A night of still air carried sound between lines more clearly than any night before. No one wanted another burst to become another funeral. The next morning, the elders agreed to speak again. The day after, pickets were told to hold fire unless fired upon, and to keep their heads below the skyline at first light. The initiative that had belonged to the defenders during the short exchanges now belonged to the negotiators. When May 8 came, the sequence was controlled and spare. Weapons were set down. Marshals stepped forward and took possession of the hamlet. Families walked out under watch. There was no march in triumph, only the unsteady exit of men and women who had held a place and a message through 71 days of winter and fire. Two lines test the counterfactual. Had federal leaders ordered an assault in March, the casualty list would almost certainly have been longer, and the prosecutions that followed might have carried a different factual record, but a heavier moral stain weakening public legitimacy for years. Had the occupiers retained open resupply and broader consensus across Pine Ridge, the siege could have stretched into summer, forcing Congress to intervene on terms more constrained for executive agencies and perhaps hardening the legal posture against blanket dismissals later. Admission against interest came not from a microphone at the berms, but from a bench months later. United States District Court Order Sioux Falls, 1974 government misconduct, including unlawful interceptions and interference with attorney-client communications, fatally taints these prosecutions. Dismissal is required to protect the integrity of the court. The human cost is written in names, and in the way the community remembers them. Frank Clearwater died after being shot near a church where he had taken shelter. Lawrence "Buddy" Lamont died near a defensive line at the place chosen for its historic burden. A United States Marshal named Lloyd Grimm lived the rest of his life paralyzed from a bullet fired on March 16. In winter count terms, the year would be marked by a siege at the old grief place, by 2 funerals inside the community, and by a federal officer who never walked again. The displacement path after May 8 was less dramatic than it might have been in an assault, but it was real. Families returned to homes altered by weeks of fear and checkpoints. Organizers faced indictments and bond conditions. Clergy and medics returned to ordinary work carrying memories of nights when a single shot could end a life or a negotiation. All of it synthesizes back to the structural forces set in motion long before February. The occupation made visible the distance between the Fort Laramie Treaty promises and the lived experience of Oglala citizens in 1973. It exposed how a national policy shift towards self-determination still ran through old channels of policing and prosecution on the ground. It revealed that the legal architecture of federal-tribal relations would not change without pressure, measured in risk and in grief. The turning point at Wounded Knee was therefore not only the moment a camp laid down arms. It was the moment the nation had to resolve, in statutes and in court, what had been argued for generations in kitchens and council houses. The siege ended, but the thread it pulled led to hearings, to dismissals that acknowledged official overreach, and to laws that would reshape how programs were run and how ceremonies could be protected. The barricades fell because supplies ran low and because families mourned. The legacy endured because the structural questions raised in winter could not be answered by cordons alone. The occupation ended on May 8, 1973. United States Marshals took possession of the hamlet after 71 days. Federal booking logs and field summaries recorded weapons collected, buildings cleared, and the transfer of detainees to Sioux Falls and Rapid City for processing. Agency histories fixed the end date and the federal lead role. Arrests and indictments followed. High-profile prosecutions against American Indian movement leaders, Dennis Banks and Russell Means, proceeded in federal court. In 1974, the district judge dismissed the case citing government misconduct, including unlawful interceptions and interference with attorney-client communications. The language was stark, and it came from the bench, not from the defense table. Subsequent summaries and civil rights case notes tracked the dismissal as a turning point in how the siege and its aftermath were judged in law as well as in public memory. Reservation boundaries did not shift because of the siege, but the policy climate did. The episode intensified scrutiny already building in Congress and the executive branch. In 1975, lawmakers enacted the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. The statute authorized tribes to assume control over programs once run by federal agencies through contracts and later compacts. In practice, this meant that Oglala Lakota programs on Pine Ridge could be negotiated and administered under tribal authority, rather than solely through distant offices. Agency explainers and later congressional primers describe the structure in plain terms and specify the two tracks that would mature over time: Section 638 contracts and self-governance compacts. Resource policy and access rights formed a second strand of change. While the siege did not rewrite leases or grazing regimes by itself, it helped drive federal acknowledgement that tribes required decision power over programs that touched land and resources. The same legal architecture that enabled health and education, contracting also supported tribal management of conservation forestry and range programs that affect daily life on reservations. University and agency guides outline how ISDEAA agreements shifted control over these domains from federal managers to tribal governments and organizations. Religious freedom moved from petition to statute in the late 1970s. Activists and elders connected restrictions on ceremony to the same pattern of control that the occupation challenged. In August 1978, Congress adopted the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Federal resources summarized the law's core purpose to protect the free exercise of native religions, including access to sacred sites and the possession of sacred objects, and to instruct agencies to evaluate their policies for compliance. The statute did not settle every dispute over land access or prisons, but it established a federal commitment that had been missing. The public law record confirms the date's sponsors and passage. Demography and health after the siege reflected long stresses more than any single week's events. Families returned to homes after roadblocks lifted, and social service caseloads rose with prosecutions, injuries, and grief. The legal collapse of the Marquis case did not erase smaller dockets. Trials for individuals continued alongside bond hearings and transfers that kept people traveling between Pine Ridge and court districts. None of this changed birth or mortality patterns by itself, but it is accurate to say that the winter's events added strain to systems already thin on staff and funds. Policy analysts who later studied the shift to tribal health and social service contracting under ISDEAA argued that the new framework aimed to correct exactly those brittle points by putting design and administration in tribal hands. Schooling and culture sat at the heart of continuance. Boarding school legacies still shaped memory on Pine Ridge in 1973. Over time, the self-determination framework enabled expansion of tribally run schools and language programs that would not have been feasible inside older administrative chains. AI Irfe's passage signaled that ceremonies once restricted by state or local rules would have a federal shield, although conflicts over sacred sites and prison policies persisted into later decades. Federal summaries and research starters explain the scope of the act and its limits and note how later laws and agency rules were needed to operationalize access. Memory work began the day the barricades fell. Oglala families buried Frank Clearwater and Lawrence Buddy Lamont, and they remembered a United States Marshal named Lloyd Grimm who left the line paralyzed from a March night. Community commemorations tied the 1973 siege to the earlier grief of 1890. That link was not folklore. It was declared in prayer during negotiations and reaffirmed in anniversaries and oral histories. National repositories keep the older treaty line visible as well. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 appears in education guides and museum collections with transcripts and images from the National Archives, a document whose promises framed much of the speech at Wounded Knee in 1973. The administrative sequels unfolded in offices rather than at ridge lines. Agencies built internal divisions to manage contracting and compacts with tribes. The Division of Self-Determination Services within Indian Affairs grew into a support hub for agreements and training. Program by program, tribes assumed control of services once managed from afar. The internal manuals and division pages explain this evolution and the practical mechanics by which a tribal government can take on federal programs with legal and fiscal accountability. In the long arc of federal-tribal relations, Wounded Knee, 1973, stands as an inflection rather than a finish. Most scholars converge on three conclusions. First, the 71-day occupation transformed treaty language from archive to agenda. Arguments long kept in petitions and classrooms had to be addressed in hearings, courtrooms, and statute books. Second, the siege exposed the limits of force in a place already weighted by memory. A cordon could contain a hamlet, but it could not settle claims about governance, ceremony, and land. Third, the episode accelerated an existing shift towards self-determination. Within 5 years, Congress and agencies erected frameworks that allowed tribes to run programs in health, education, and natural resources under their own authority. None of these changes began at the barricades, but all moved faster because the barricades held long enough to demand answers. Points of dispute endure. Participants and analysts differ on the tactical wisdom of the occupation and on the role of national organizers relative to Oglala citizens who live the risks day to day. Some federal voices argue the siege hardened factions and deepened rifts on Pine Ridge without delivering measurable local reform. Others within the community contend that without the winter stand, investigations would have stalled and the larger legal turn would have been delayed again. Casualty numbers are not contested, but individual responsibility for specific exchanges of fire remains debated in oral histories and memoirs. There is also a continuing argument over how centrally the word treaty should sit in policy discourse, with some emphasizing program control and others insisting that any administrative gain is only a proxy for the older promises. The enduring legacy is threefold. As Doctrine Wounded Knee underscored that public order operations in Indian country must be framed within treaty history and civil rights law, a lesson carried into training and oversight. As reform, the occupation is part of the lineage of statutes that structure the modern era of tribal self-administration and the protection of native religious practice. As symbol, the place binds two dates separated by 83 years. Families who remember the dead of 1890 and the dead of 1973 speak of the same ground and of the same demand to be heard. Each anniversary draws elders, youth, and visitors who connect a winter decision to occupy a hamlet with a broader insistence that programs and ceremonies be governed by those to whom they belong. What endures in memory is not a single gunshot or a single meeting, but the recognition that on a low set of ridges in South Dakota, a small community forced a large government to answer in law rather than at a checkpoint. From archives to community memory, we piece together the full picture. Which evidence felt most convincing to you? Do you agree with our final assessment or challenge it? Share your view in the comments. Thank you for watching.